Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Ramirez, and I'm part of a JHU team that's been making these recommendations for COP26. And here's the rest of my team.
I'm Arpita Rajasekhar.
Hi, my name is Daniel Hong.
Hi, I'm Aniket Borolif.
Yeah, I'm Juan also.
Hi, I'm Yezabel.
Hi, my name is Avery.
Artapa, can you lead us off?
Yes. Decisions made in this November's COP26 meeting in Glasgow will impact the landscape of our world for generations to come. The UN representatives will get together to draw up a climate agenda for the next decade. Now, some may ask if NATO, a military alliance, should be concerned with climate change. And we believe that the answer is yes, and for three reasons. Because climate change makes the world more dangerous, because climate change makes it harder for our militaries to keep our people safe, and because we all have a responsibility to do more to combat climate change. With this being said, our presentation today will focus on three recommendations that NATO and the rest of the world should strive to meet in response to climate change. We will look into an overview of the problem, a roadmap of the solution, effective data tracking, and ideas to finance our efforts.
So first, let's talk about the problem. We lack the data, resources, and technologies to handle climate change as it is currently from the NATO perspective. Because we have several military assets. These are our jets, our battleships, other hard power assets. And we also have our operational assets, such as the support elements that make sure our troops can operate. And we have our building assets, which are our bases. But in this scope, we're usually thinking in the terms of direct assets, where these emissions that come from these assets that I just listed out, we only really keep track of fuel, heating, and ammunition use. This presents a relatively simple problem, actually, when we look at the direct emissions that come from militaries, where the grand majority of emissions from militaries directly comes from fuel consumption overall. However, this is an oversimplification of the problem, because we also have the indirect emissions to think about. This is the production of the resources and transportation of those resources that our troops need. And when we actually start thinking about these indirect emissions, it presents a much larger percentage of the overall problem. And these indirect emissions actually represent a very different type of problem, which require many different solutions. So this means that we don't have there is no one size fits all approach. And at the same time, we need to expand our thinking from just tracking direct emissions to thinking holistically of the entire system.
So with all these factors in mind, one of our primary aims is for NATO to source 90% of its energy from renewable energies by 2050. We will start off with a roadmap on how we're going to get there. In order to make this possible, we propose that from 2021 to 2025, nations spend time and resources toward identifying what green technologies are best suited for them. This could include solar, nuclear, geothermal, and more. And the reason we bring up these respective technologies is because each of these technologies has their own respective limitations, benefits, and drawbacks. Some technologies, such as geothermal, can only be used in certain regions where the Earth's crust is thin, while other technologies, such as nuclear or wind, have drawbacks that aren't necessarily CO2 emissions. As such, it is up to each NATO nation to identify which technology is best suited for them. From 2025 to 2030, we propose further investment into identifying these technologies and producing the infrastructure necessary to produce these green energies effectively. Based on current trends in batteries, biomass waste plants, and nuclear forming research, we could see many of these technologies become increasingly viable and more versatile within the next 5 years with the right investments into the facilities and the research. And from 2030 to 2050, we propose implementation of these technologies necessary to capitalize on these new forms of energy. This could include, but is not limited, to form of energy storage, electric crate motors, or new vehicles to make use of electricity or new sources of fuel. Overall, by having 90% of its energy being sourced from renewable energies by 2050, NATO can ensure its vehicles and technologies stay relevant and its energy stays independent of outside influences. Now, let's go a bit into what makes up a green technology and how to categorize these new standards.
So we've decided on defining what green tech is. And so there are a few characteristics that we'd like to see. The first is a reduction in energy consumption. Second is a reduction in carbon emissions. And then finally, a reduction in material waste. Okay, so we've sort of established a renewable fuel standard. We'd start off with those conventional renewable fuels, which will provide a 20% or more greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And examples would include cornstarch. We'd move into advanced biofuels, which would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% or more. And examples would include sugarcane or biobutanol. And then it would be biomass-based diesels, which is going to be a 50% or more greater greenhouse gas emission reduction, with examples being soybean oil, waste oil, and animal fats. And then cellulosic biofuels, which would be a 60% or more reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and examples be biogas and wood chips. So these final two, that cellulosic biofuel and then biomass-based diesels, while they provide the greatest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, they also count as second and third generation biofuels, meaning that they're not going to take away from food sources or land that's used for food sources, or even contribute to wastewater. So in calculating those life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, it's a full calculation from the feedstock to the production process to the fuel usage itself. So it accounts for both emissions and for different sinks. So if, for example, you're using like algae-based biofuels, those take in a lot of those emissions. So it would provide a calculation of all those things. So just to reiterate, you're going to start off with the renewable fuels, which provided 20% or more reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Next would be those advanced biofuels and the biodiesels, which would be a 50% or more reduction. And then finally, those cellulosic fuels, which provide a 60% or more reduction. And so the question becomes then, like, what are the barriers to implementation, and why isn't there widespread use of biofuels or green tech in the military? And there are a few different reasons for that. The first is that green consideration again. So a lot of these biofuels don't have as many emissions like in the actual fuel, but sometimes you need to consider what that means for food sources, or any kind of contribution to wastewater or taking away from land use. And so next we go into the integrated aspect of biofuels. You want to know that you're going to be able to blend the biofuel with your conventional fuel, and you'll still be able to work it into the equipment that the military has. Next would be that reliability, and there are two aspects to this. First is that you'll have a reliable source, so a very strong supply chain. We need to know that biofuels will be produced continuously and reliably. And then second is that you need to know that the biofuel will be reliable in the equipment itself, and just operable. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is that biofuels need to be very cost competitive. Petroleum, it changes in price a lot, but generally it tends to be cheaper than most biofuels. And so these reasons are why we'd like NATO to really take into consideration our recommendations for the future of green tech.
So now we want to talk about our second recommendation, which is that we should standardize the tracking of data for emissions within the military. So this was a huge roadblock in our research. When trying to find the acquisition of assets for each military, the bookkeeping was very different from each NATO country. So not only was it hard to find emission data, but also just what number of assets they were purchasing annually. So looking at standardization, in Italy, they have one of the most extensive record keeping practices. So not only is it separated by section between naval and aviation, it also records the quantity of assets acquired and the price in billion euros. But this isn't even from an official document. This was a news bulletin done by Defense News in Canada. So what we're proposing is that we move more towards the UK standardization, where in the UK Defense Equipment Plan, it tracks the quantity of every asset acquired for that year. But in addition to that, there should be a column added that tracks the tons of CO2 associated with each individual asset. So an example would be for the F-35 fighter jet that was purchased by the UK in 2020. They purchased a total of 48, and with each jet, it is associated 48.76 tons of CO2. So having that information directly across from each asset will allow the information to be very defensible. Now, we also want to talk about the indirect contributions to these emissions. As like we were saying, these assets, the emissions while they're being used is not the same as the entirety of the emissions behind it. So what we want to look at is the model done by the US Environmental Protection Agency, which is their greenhouse gas reporting program. So not only is the end user, in this case the military, reporting the emissions that are coming from their assets, but also the suppliers and direct emitters would report their emissions as well. So this would account for the emissions that are given off in the production of these assets. So while these jets and tanks are being assembled, as well as emissions as a result of these assets being recycled or retired. So what effect they have on landfills.
So our final recommendation is in regards to getting the capital needed to make some of these green technologies a reality. So we all know that at the end of the day, nothing gets done without money. That is why we are recommending that NATO allies raise their green expenditure spending to 1% of their country's GDP. We envision one of the main headlines to come out of COP26 to be NATO allies pledge to contribute 1% of GDP on green expenditures. So how do we get to this 1%? Looking into military spending, we can see that there are large disparities in climate spending, even though we know that climate change is a rising threat that needs to be addressed. But it needs to be addressed in tandem with the current military threats faced by NATO allies. If you look on the left, the US, although their ratio has been improving, is spending around $50 on defense for every $1 spent on climate finance. We believe that a healthier ratio that meets the threat of climate change is closer to COP26's own host country, the United Kingdom. If you look on the right, the UK has been doubling down on climate spending, reaching a ratio of around $2 spent on defense for every $1 spent on climate. Furthermore, we can see from this graph that the EU average spending on green expenditures is 0.8%. This further shows that an incremental increase to 1% is a feasible goal for NATO allies to reach by 2030. There are also more answers in a past NATO pledge. In 2014, NATO allies pledged to spend 2% of their GDP on defense expenditures by 2024. At the time of the pledge, the average military spending for NATO countries was at 1.7%. The reason that 2% was the chosen benchmark was because the dignitaries at the time felt that 2% was a feasible goal that all allies could reach. A 1% GDP spending on green expenditures is a feasible and necessary goal for NATO allies to reach in order to rise up to the threats posed by climate change. While we know that asking allies for an extra 1% of GDP for climate expenditures, while these allies are cash-strapped with providing COVID-19 relief to their peoples and to their economies, we believe that this pledge makes it easier to get the public on board while also reinforcing member countries' commitment to climate change goals. The implications of this pledge can usher in a new era of green tech innovation. This incremental increase will ultimately result in over $400 billion being spent on climate change expenditures in both civil and military sectors, just in NATO allies alone. The move will also result in total green expenditures rising by over 40%. And this is the amount of finance being spent by both private investors and government entities. With this said, how can NATO allies raise these funds?
So to raise the required funds of like 1% of the GDP, we suggest that NATO use the financial instrument of bonds to raise the required money. So the 1% of the GDP of each of all the 30 NATO allies will amount to $424 billion. Now, this money would be raised by issuing bonds by NATO, and this bonds would be supposedly be AAA rated bonds because NATO has already issued bonds in past, and they can be guaranteed as AAA rated bonds. And one of the advantage of this would be like it is an affordable debt. The NATO can afford it, and the countries borrowing money from NATO through these bonds can afford it. The second advantage would be that it is easier than rebalancing the budgets of all these countries. So for example, if USA has to set out like 1% of the GDP for green expenditures, they can, instead of rebalancing their all budgeting activities, they can just borrow money from NATO and continue with their expenditure and technological progress for green sector. And finally, it is a good method to, for long-term financing, because most of the countries will end up borrowing money for a longer period of time, say for 20 or 30 years in the future. And bonds are very good instruments to for lending money for a longer period of time. And finally, in 2025, these countries will end up giving NATO the final plan, blueprint for how they will use this money to structure their green expenditures. And NATO, in the end, finally will distribute these monies to different countries according to their required budget for green expenditures. And NATO will partner with the World Bank for these activities, because NATO doesn't have any hardcore experience regarding financials. And the World Bank will help NATO regarding this. And moreover, the World Bank will also hold the money in escrow so that they can lend it to the countries whenever they require. So this partnership between NATO and World Bank would provide a better leverage for countries borrowing money from them.
In summary, the tangible outcomes that we want to see for the NATO alliance coming from the COP26 meeting in November would be: 1, a clear roadmap for NATO militaries to move from hard power to green technology by the year 2050. 2, standardized measurement, tracking, and reporting of greenhouse gas data. And 3, the 1% GDP pledge to raise funds for these green efforts. These outcomes at the COP26 meeting will ensure that the NATO alliance drives forward the development and adoption of green technology in the defense sector. The climate is in our hands. Thank you very much. We would like to thank Mr. Rob Murray for helping us throughout the project. He's the head of innovation at NATO, and he was mentoring us throughout. We would like to thank Pam for giving us this opportunity, and Annie, Julie, Ujwal, and Charlie, thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, the floor is open for questions. Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Perhaps I can kick things off. So first of all, for those who don't know me, my name is Rob Murray. I'm the head of innovation at NATO, and so I'm currently sat in my office in Brussels, where it is 9:20, and we've got a rather large bit of policy work to try and get done tonight, so it's going to be a late night. However, I've taken a break from that to be able to come and listen to an outstanding presentation by the team there. So my sincere congratulations to what is a very, very challenging piece of work and analysis, and which has been done in a very succinct manner. So a really huge well done. I think my question for the team is, as you've conducted this research and looked into this subject matter, what is the one thing which really stands out as perhaps the biggest issue, challenge, barrier, which you believe the Alliance is going to need to address to really trying to get to grips with some of the recommendations that you've made?
Right, so I think I'll take this question. Overall, it really is as simple as standardizing and collecting the data to make the proper decisions. Because we faced great difficulty when we were trying to make research to see what the scope of the problem was, and we found very quickly that the data may be present somewhere, but it's not easy to get into one place or to make comprehensive decisions, because each country measures it differently with different standards, different methods, and you can't make good strategic decisions if you just don't have the data available. So it is one of the biggest problems that we had to deal with ourselves, and I think that going forwards, it's going to be a problem unless the Alliance is able to create these comprehensive standards that everyone has to report to in the same manner.
That's great. Many thanks, Kate.
Yeah. Other questions?
Oh yeah, I guess I'll ask a question. Hey everybody. So in the beginning, you mentioned that each NATO country in the beginning phase of recommendation 1, I believe, is going to identify green tech that's suitable or applicable to them. And you mentioned like geothermal and nuclear. I'm wondering if each member nation segmenting their fuel resources is actually going to weaken the alliance, because, for example, an adversary could take out the geothermal plants in Turkey or Iceland and then kind of cause major havoc for those countries' ability to, I guess, provide fuel to their armies.
I do have a little bit of a comment on that. And actually, from what I read, a lot of militaries have seen biofuels or just green tech in general as kind of a safeguard against that, because so many of them really rely on conventional petroleum, and those supply chains have been disrupted in the past. And so I think it's a very optimistic viewpoint that they have with biofuels and just creating a new source for fuel in general. So I don't know that it would be detrimental to these militaries.
And to add on to that, effectively what we would be advocating for is a diversification of risk rather than creating new ones. In this case, having different infrastructures set up would actually build resiliency within the systems.
I have a question. How will you, in your planning, given the lead times that militaries need in their planning, how will you integrate advances in technology as they come online? How are you going to build that into this scenario?
Sure. So this would go into section in regards to the standards for biofuels at the current moment. So those are based off of, there's a set metric, for example, corn oil. And as a comparison point, if it has a 20% reduction in CO2 emissions, that's considered green. So future technologies would be following similar standards as well.
Okay. So you could just filter those in as they became available?
Yep. Because currently some of the suggestions were based off of technologies that are already known or already available. But 5 years ago, a lot of these technologies didn't exist. And I would assume that 5 to 10 years from now, there's going to be very many new technologies that come out. So we want to keep Section X a bit more broad for a standard so that NATO allies could integrate new technologies in as well.
I can see Bill Smedic has his hand up, so I don't want to sort of steal the floor too much. But I just want to add something just from a sort of as a practitioner's perspective, Pam's question there. I think fundamentally the real challenge, in notwithstanding the technical points that the team just highlighted, Daniel highlighted, is really about defense acquisition and defense procurement and the power of incumbents and the way in which contracts are written.
Right.
So I think the technical ability to integrate various technologies as they sort of become mature is, I would suggest, relatively straightforward in relative terms. I would highlight that the bigger barrier is the contractual ways of making that a reality, given the influence and power of many large armaments and defense companies.
Yes, I think you're exactly right.